So this evening, we've reawakened the Café Philo idea, and this is one where there's that little bit of echo coming, isn't there?
I think it's okay at the moment. I think it's okay at the moment.
Yeah, it's okay. Anyhow, tonight we have the Café Philo, which means that we who are nominal speakers, we don't have to do the work, you do the work. So we'll only be saying a little bit, and it's up to you. So to kick us off, I'd like to ask Mike to say a few words.
Yeah, the idea of the topic, the world is becoming a better place, is to see what philosophical insights we could have into that, rather than it being some sort of opportunity to exhibit our prejudices and complain the world's going to hell in a handcart, but rather look at the thing from various philosophical perspectives. And in any good philosophical discussion, the first thing you need to do is look at your terms. And we have three active terms here, which we need to consider. First of all, the world. We have to consider what we mean by the world. Now, we may mean different things, and maybe you could perm these terms. Do we mean the people? Do we mean most of the people? Do we mean the physical world, the biological world? So all of those things would need to be considered, or individually consider it from that perspective. The world is becoming. Now, obviously, the word becoming suggests time. Is it becoming better tomorrow? Was it better yesterday? Or are we talking in terms of 100 years? Or are we talking 1,000 years? Or are we talking sort of in epochs of many thousand years? So again, that gives us different perspectives, and people might want to talk from those. Maybe the world is a worse place today than it was yesterday, but a better place than it was 10,000 years ago. And then finally, what do we mean by a better place? In what sense better? Do we mean materially better? Do we mean that people are happier? Do we mean there's more wildlife? All of these things, I think, are the sort of things we want to consider. So that's what we want to look at. I think we're considering also, in one sense, a sort of post-Enlightenment view. I think before the Enlightenment, people just considered very much that the world went on and nothing really changed. But after that, people began to be to assess change. One of the important books that I mentioned, I think it is a very important book, is Pinker's book, Steven Pinker's book, because I think that book looks much more scientifically about how the world has changed over vast millennia. And one of the useful things, I think at least it does, is it debunks Rousseau, who had this sort of almost religious prelapsarian view that of the noble savage, that years ago it was wonderful, you know, everyone lived the perfect life, and it was only the coming of civilization that actually destroyed people's lives. I think what Pinker certainly does is roundly destroy that view and point out that you know, life was brutal and hard, and there is sound archaeological evidence for how brutal life was for people who lived, let us say, 50,000 years ago. So anyway, those are the thoughts to get us underway. I've said, you know, different perspectives. That doesn't mean we have to take any given perspective, or you have to take any given perspective. If you want to argue the world's certainly better than it was 10,000 years ago, but worse than it was 100 years ago, that's absolutely valid. If you want to say it's better for society in general, but worse for some people, then fine. You know, those are all valid points of view from a philosophical point of view. I think that's enough for the time being.
Yeah, I guess we started.
Yes, so welcome everybody to the first Café Philo in years. So obviously the pandemic made this more or less impossible, but it's great to actually have a Café Philo, which is all about discussing important topics. And today's topic is probably very topical and very poignant, and something that we all need to consider, not just in the short term, but in the long term. Is the world becoming a better place. And there's so many dimensions here. So there's not really any right or wrong answers. We're not expecting you to weigh the scales of justice here to say, you know, is it getting better or worse? Maybe at the end, we can have a collective view as to where, on balance, it is becoming a better place or not. But as Mike already highlighted, the world and better and place are things that need to be defined. And, you know, who is the world becoming a better place for? Is it us, some of us? Is it nature? Is it the animal species? And, you know, there's plenty of information around. And for those of you who attended some of the World in 2050 series, it's very clear that there isn't just one world. You know, there is a social world, there is an economic world, there is a political world, there's an environmental world, a technological world. There's lots of different aspects of the world. And some of them may be trending on a positive trajectory and others may not. And I think that's why a group discussion, an open discussion around where we are and where we're heading, I think is a really powerful thing. Just to let you know, online, by the way, feel free to unmute and show the video if you want to participate in the discussion. This is the first one. This is the first Café Philo where we've tried to do this for an online audience as well as an in-room audience. So hopefully everybody can participate. I've got 2 willing volunteers in the audience here in the room, armed with microphones. So if people in the room want to ask questions, just please raise your hand, and then I'm sure a microphone will find its way to you. The only thing is, the reason why we have microphones here is not because you in the room wouldn't be able to hear us without them, but the Zoom audience won't be able to hear the questions or the observations by you in the room here unless you speak into the microphone. And please speak directly into the microphone like this, rather than like that, because it's not a multi-directional microphone, it's unidirectional, so you have to speak straight into that. So that's really it from my perspective. Don, do you want to say a few words before we get going?
No, I think we can. The idea to switch on.
Okay.
But I think we can throw the floor open, and there are quite a lot of different points there. I'll maybe come in and aggregate some of them as we go on.
Okay, so whilst we're throwing the floor open to you, I think Ollie may have to come back and sort out Don's microphone. But who would like to start on the topic of tonight?
Since I've got the microphone, it makes sense for me.
You have the power.
I guess I'm starting with a statement rather than a question. I think the world today is 3 years. Sorry, the world today is better than it was 3 years ago. 3 years ago was 2020, and we were heading into another 3-month lockdown. So I think that's been improvement. I think there's been improvement as well in terms of the balance between workers and managers, where people have been working from home more often since then, because it was kind of forced upon us because of the lockdowns.
Yeah.
But I think none of these things can be taken for granted, because it's always, every time one group wins and they have a better world, someone else is losing. So if people who are enjoying work from home, if they take it for granted, they're going to lose it. Just like in America, they tell it, hey, we won Roe versus Wade, we won abortion rights. So well, all people lost. And now, depending on your perspective, it's better there now than it was before.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's interesting. I mean, we could do this as a show of hands as far as, is the world a better place than it was 3 years ago when we were in pandemic lockdown? Who agrees with that statement? Okay, well, I mean, interestingly enough, I mean, I don't know about the online audience, but I mean, that's only probably about 50-50 in the room.
You didn't ask for those who think it's worse.
But, so so that means, yeah, who in the room actually thinks it's worse now than it was? Okay, so there you go. So that's interesting in itself.
Well, that's on the grounds of 2 major wars that have started since the pandemic.
Yeah, so there's the geopolitical side of things.
Also, when we were in lockdown, there was much less pollution. The world was a lot cleaner and calmer. And I think there was a lot to be said for that.
Okay. Michael, do you want to say something?
Well, I've got a couple of points. One at this stage. One is that I think it's interesting we're doing this Café Philo with. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
You can hear me, can you? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Good. I think
We can see you too.
It's very interesting that we're doing this Café Philo with a Zoom audience, a Zoom participation, as well as people in the room. We can't see the people in the room. How many are there in the room, roughly?
Oh, there's about 20.
20, yes. Well, there's about, there's only about half a dozen of us on Zoom. So that's an interesting mix. And it's a good test of this hybrid method that we are developing at the BRLSI. It's been very difficult to get a good mix between Zoom participants and participants in the room. Very difficult, but I think it seems to be working quite well tonight, the way we laid it on, although we can't see the people in the room. Anyway, that's my first point. Second point, I think 3 years is far too short a time scale. I think we've got to be looking at this thing over the period of several years, if not 20 or 30 or even 50, to have any sort of feel for it. I think that we've got to take a longer time scale, because the last 3 years have been very unusual years, very unusual, with the COVID experience that we've had, which has thrown everything off course. And we are being quite slow to recover from that. I think we've got to take a longer viewpoint.
Well, I chose the 3 years because I think the pandemic was a crisis that accelerated a lot of change that was happening before. And you mentioned traffic. Traffic was so nice, and during the pandemic, there was hardly any cars. And after people got out of lockdowns, I really noticed the sound that traffic makes. And I thought, wow, it was nice. You could walk along the street, you could cycle, you can hear the birds. So that's gotten worse.
Okay. Can I just say, I think that's one of the dangers of saying things are getting better or worse. COVID was living hell for some people. Let's be frank about that. For people like myself, it was a doddle. I worked in my nice long garden. I could chat to my neighbors over the fence. I had my family around me. Yeah, it was probably for me a very good time. But there were people for whom it was an appalling time. And I just say that because I think that comes back to, what I was saying at the beginning. One perspective, there isn't perhaps one perspective for everybody.
Well, maybe the lady who talked about climate might want to say a few more words, because I think that's quite an interesting. That's obviously a very long-term thing, which is speeding up now, and obviously has implications for all of us.
Yeah, when I was talking about, I take absolutely what you said, but it was noticeable, and it reminded people just how frantic the world has become, the Western world. Obviously we're talking about this country and the West particularly. Not quite sure how. Well, we'll move on to that. But clearly, the climate and the ecological disaster that is upon us is, when you were talking about, what are we talking about? What's the world? And the first thought is, or my first thought was, it is the whole world and everything that lives on the planet. And the human species is just making a complete hash of the whole. We are destroying the planet that sustains us. So to that extent, my belief is that the world is getting worse, or things are getting worse in that respect.
And do you feel there's any glimmer of hope?
Yes, there's a glimmer of hope in that I work with startups, and every startup I work with is creating something that is either sustainable or it's trying to deal with wastes, or, you know, all of the younger people especially are very much aware that something has to be done and that time is running out. And I think I always say that my generation is the one that ate all the pies, because, you know, we've known the damage we're doing, but we haven't taken any action. He has the questions.
Yes, there's another gentleman over there.
Thanks. Yeah, I was thinking about this from the work of Thomas Piketty, the French economist who had a surprise blockbuster hit with his book Capital a decade or so ago. And he mainly argues that if you take the longer view, things have definitely improved. I mean, he's mainly looking at in terms of inequality and kind of the rise of democracy and oligarchy. So if you look back in the time of, you know, Jane Austen or whatever, these huge differences in wealth, you know, very few rich people and a mass of poorer people. And then the situation improves. And then now he's arguing that we have sort of, there's that famous kind of U-shaped graph that looks at like the percentage of wealth held by the, you know, top 1%. And it's right up at the top in like 1920s kind of, you know, Gilded Age, and then kind of goes down post-war and then spikes back up. And so his, you know, people say he rejects the idea that he's a pessimist. He says, no, if you take the long view, actually, we've had huge improvements, but we've just been going in the wrong direction for the last 4 or 5 decades. And then the other thing that caught my eye was there's something about, on here, there's a question, can the world be said to be getting better from a materialist perspective, but worse from a humanistic, spiritual, individualist perspective? And I do think there is something about that, about kind of soul values, if you want to call that. It seems like we've gone astray, and it seems to me like there's been a huge mass experiment basically with humans, with social media and the internet, and sort of, it does seem, you know, maybe, I don't know statistically, but like the rise of young people hurting themselves or, you know, committing suicide, and everyone comparing themselves against some sort of perfect Instagram vision of someone else's life, and, you know, the spread of fake news and things like that. Maybe that might be a flash in the pan, but I sometimes, one of my pessimistic moments, I think about how when the printing press came in and had, you know, the pamphlets that led to, you know, 200 years of religious war in Europe, and whether the kind of unleashing of social media, you know, everyone has an opinion, and the loudest, most, you know, loudest voiced sort of people tend to get the most attention, whether that will also, you know, and maybe we're seeing it now, hopefully not, sort of, you know, basically lead to worse times ahead.
So
I think one of the things that, can you hear me? Is my microphone on?
I think so.
Yeah.
Can Michael hear you?
Hmm?
Can you hear Michael?
No. Anyhow, I was going to say, one of the things that is perhaps a notable improvement, or it might not be, depending how you look upon it, is that we have a widening circle of altruism. We began as social animals, learning to negotiate morality with those who were close to us, who we were in communication with. But since Gutenberg, I suppose, we've expanded the means of communication, and it's now very much more expanded in the last few years. And we tend to negotiate morality with people with whom we're in communication, and that circle is widening. And that's really a matter of technology, but one could imagine that that is a good thing.
And is that what you meant by social media, or did you look at the darker side of social media? Do you think social media is a positive influence in us becoming more communicative with each other and more altruistic, or do you see it as something else?
I was talking about it from a negative point of view. I mean, personally, there's good things I've got from it, but I also see its kind of addictive qualities. And I guess looking at the internet more generally, you know, there's amazing things on there like internet and the people who, you know, before couldn't afford to, right now you could probably get an education on the internet that you would have to pay tens of thousands of pounds at an Ivy League university if you go in the right place, but you can also get a negative education. I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, it's I was talking about social media.
But of course, most of us go on it for trivia, don't we?
Since I have the microphone again, I think social media is an interesting sort of thing, because I think you, like you said, Don, it encourages communication with other people, the internet. But I think the trouble with it is it should be like a tool, like Facebook should be a tool where I go on Facebook and it tells me that there's people nearby who I can meet up in real life and I can meet interesting people, but it doesn't. It's designed to encourage online only interactions because that's what they monetize, which ends up with some people living in bubbles away from reality, because it makes it really easy for them to connect to people who only agree, rather than in real life, I'm always going to encounter somebody who disagrees with me. That helps me refine my argument and go, oh, there's a real world out there. So I think like social media, if you could, it can be used helpfully to start a conversation with others, but I think it has to be a tool to get people to meet in real life, to make the world a better place. Because I think otherwise, if people spend all their time on media and only connect to people that share their views already, it's going to make the world worse, because these people will just wall themselves off in magical thinking.
So you put the point about things like Facebook making people live in a bubble. I'm not sure that people always didn't live in bubbles. I think they always did. They lived in their village, they lived in their group, their friends, or they lived in their church or whatever it was. And I don't think actually, I'm not sure people live any more in bubbles now than they ever did. Because there was no, there was no way of interacting. In fact, there's more chance now of interacting with somebody who's different to you. Back even 50 years ago, there was very little chance of interacting with anyone who was different to you, except when you went to university, possibly. But apart from that, not really.
Well, I think in real life, like there's just more diversity of opinion, even in communities and towns, and
Yeah.
people are more of a chance to actually listen to each other and have feedback and communication, like you're saying. I guess what I'm trying to say with the bubble, the difference, the nuance is that on the internet, I don't have to read what anyone's saying. I don't have to have a conversation. I can just keep posting my stuff over and over again. In real life, there would be some kind of feedback. People would ostracize you, or they try to talk to you. They try to mediate. So yeah, it's an interesting point. Are we? I guess maybe bubble as well. I mean, just more magical thinking, just divorced from reality. The whole perspective of living in a room and never going outside. And the bubbles you mentioned in the past, the villages, the towns, the religious community, at least they still interacted with the real world. They left their houses.
So from what I think you're saying is that actually over a period of time, and whether that's the last 10,000 years or the last 50 years, as humans, we have developed more and more effective tools to help us in our daily lives. Let's call it that. But I think what you seem to be questioning is whether we've developed these tools in a positive, constructive way, or whether we are actually using the tools not necessarily to make the world a better place. Is that what you mean?
I think that, yeah, I guess that's sort of what I mean. What I'm trying to say is that the technology today it's the world's a better place in a lot of ways, like you were saying about online courses, online degrees. But I think that the downside, the thing that's made it worse, is it's made it easier for people to forget there's a world at all. Yeah. They can just live in their own head at home, getting food delivered, groceries delivered, and lose contact.
So the lady who's speaking now, could she speak into the microphone, please? And then, because otherwise the Zoom audience won't be able to hear.
I said, Duncan has written on the up on the board saying that some people are still in lockdown, and thank goodness there is the internet for communication. He said, thank goodness we still do Zoom meetings. So maybe he would have something to say about it from his perspective.
Okay, Duncan, do you want to say something, or do you just prefer just putting it into the chat? Because you have, please feel free to unmute at any time if you want to, Duncan. Okay. Okay. Thank you for that.
I was going to say, coming back to perhaps the point made earlier, I don't think the internet has created or removed either good or bad behaviors that weren't already there. And I'm just thinking about the way I would have, I mean, I was born in the 60s, the way if I wanted to find out something in the 70s or 80s, I'd have had to go down the library and I'd only find one book with only one opinion on it. Whereas on the internet, I can find 20, 30, 40, 50 opinions on something. And I think that diversifies. And I think that's, on the whole, I think that's a good thing. Obviously, there's bad things on the internet as well. But I think on the whole, the internet can only be a good thing on the whole.
So you actually think the additional viewpoints and information that's available is actually leading to more diverse views rather than polarized views?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Good. Well, I mean, what we're obviously discussing we're in the human sphere of whether the world is getting a better place at the moment, which is interesting. But even then, it sounds as if, what criteria should we use let's stick with the humans, from a human perspective as to whether the world is getting a better place? What are the criteria? We heard from this gentleman, economically, for example, that might be a positive trend. If you look back as to what happened, hundreds and thousands of years ago in comparison, we seem to be leading more comfortable lives, but are there other dimensions that we need to use to evaluate whether the world is becoming a better place?
For me, one of the important dimensions is the notion of human flourishing. And I think human flourishing takes many forms. I think maybe the discussion so far has tended to focus on Western nations at the moment, whereas clearly, huge proportion of the world is, live in very different cultures. And for them, the idea of flourishing will look and feel very different. I think for me, one of the dimensions that maybe we've not mentioned so far, although maybe it's been implicit in some of the discussion, is to do with the notion of how well equipped or otherwise are we to live an examined life, how well educated are we around the nature of what it means to be human, and how our innate psychology and humanness then relates to this very fast changing world in which we live, of which perhaps the internet and AI is perhaps one of the most significant changes that we're now facing. I think Jonathan Haidt is doing a number of talks and things on YouTube at the moment relating to a new book that he has coming out, which talks in some detail about the evidence around the impact of social media on young people in particular, and a lot of the data is really very disconcerting, and he actually describes it as almost an experiment in which we are rewiring the brains, particularly of young people who are growing up, whose lives are very much shaped by that medium in which they live their lives, much more than we used to, certainly when I was young, and whose lives are framed through that.
Okay, well, I mean, that's very interesting, isn't it? Because flourishing goes back to Aristotle and his eudaimonia. But I think the problem is that sometimes in the Western world that gets translated as happiness rather than flourishing life, and happiness can be quite a sort of transient. I'm happy that I'm in this room right now, but I might be very unhappy because it's going to be raining later. And I think human flourishing is a life as a whole, isn't it? Is that what you mean? Yeah. And what kind of measures? Because I mean, there's things like the happiness index and things like that out there that sort of measure things beyond economic values. And what kind of sort of criteria would you use for things like flourishing?
The trouble with happiness is it's a very difficult thing to define.
Yeah.
And in fact, it may not be a definition of welfare, because one tends to be happy when one's welfare is increasing. And when one's welfare is decreasing, one's less happy. And so a billionaire who becomes a millionaire is unhappy, whereas a poor man who becomes a millionaire is very happy. So happiness is to some extent the rate of change of welfare rather than the welfare itself.
Can I just throw a couple of points in that are interested about this business of happiness? There was a survey about which part of
No, we finish and then we get Duncan in a minute.
which part of this the British Isles are the happiest, and it came out clearly that one area was the happiest. But it then turned out, further research showed, it had more drug abuse, more self-harm, more domestic violence, and more suicide than any other area in the country. So it's very dangerous to ask people if they're happy, because they can give you really spurious results.
I think we want to know which area it was.
I think I better not tell you which area it was, but you can dive back and find out which area it was.
Well, I think this is why happiness is a misnomer, and I think that's why the gentleman, you know, talking about human flourishing as a life as a whole, and being able to qualify what that means is actually quite a powerful notion. So, do you have any ideas in that respect?
So, I think as human beings, going back to this notion of, you know, understanding what enables us to flourish. I mean, one of the important things seems to me is the notion of being in relationship, not being socially isolated. I think we're hardwired to flourish when we have good relationships, and I think going back, you know, one of the data sets that's become a health priority for this country and for many other Western nations in particular is the impact of social isolation, not just as something that maybe isn't desirable in its own right, but actually has an adverse impact on people's health and well-being. I think for me another one is to do with the notion of some kind of inner journey, some kind of journey of self-understanding, which I think is important in that it holds the potential of being able to engage with all of the things that life can throw at any of us at any time with a greater degree of equanimity than we might otherwise do if we become particularly identified with being successful or being beautiful or being, you know, whatever the range of things are that many of us at some points in our lives can become overly identified with. So, I mean, there are other things that I could point to, but that's a couple to be going on with.
Duncan, you've got your virtual hand up.
Yes, as soon as you said, did I want to contribute, I started pressing buttons and I suddenly left the meeting, so I've got back in now. Yes, I'm very pleased that you still do Zoom meetings, because my wife has health problems, which means that you've effectively got to be very careful about socializing with people, because the place where I would very much like to be this evening is in Bath in Queen Square. So I'm greatly missing going to meetings there and also acting and all sorts of things, because effectively for a group of people, there's the lockdown still effectively applies. Changing the subject completely, while now you've given me the chance, about social media creating bubbles. I have to take issue with Mike. The fact that I live close to a group of people doesn't mean that I would agree with them. That they all, you know, if I look at my immediate neighbours, several of them vote completely differently from me. We would argue about things, whereas on social media, the chap who was saying before that you create a group and then people join who then reinforce it and get much more groupthink than you would just by meeting a random group of people who would live near you, or you would meet somewhere. So there's much more, I feel, bubbles arising as a result of social media.
Okay. So Duncan, I mean, are you a fan of Zoom as far as?
I've become a fan of Zoom. Yes, great fan. Other people have stopped using Zoom. They feel it's all over. But I'm glad to say that you carry on using Zoom, and long may it continue. All I can say, because I'd much rather be in the room.
But you think social media itself is currently trending more in creating bubbles rather than a meaningful exchange of communication?
Yes, I mean there are odd things in social media, like having a Zoom meeting where I'm disagreeing with Mike, who says you don't get more social bubbles. So that it's nice to have this opportunity to disagree with him. But generally speaking, on Facebook and all sorts of groups, people talk to people who agree with them, and they encourage each other in a more extreme form of as was shown by groupthink. That if you get a group of people, everyone wants to be the, if you like, the most extreme member of the group, and therefore they move more and more and more towards extreme views, which we can see happening very, very clearly.
Thank you, Duncan.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about contentment, because I don't think contentment is the same thing necessarily as happiness. It's more of an acceptance of how things are. And I think, we, have been told that, say, tribes in the Amazon actually are happy because their expectations are less, and that there's a much greater contentment. And I work at a college with young people, and I've had children, and I think contentment is something that's not really even necessarily considered in our society anymore. We're looking for fulfillment in so many different ways, and social media, thank goodness, was around for youngsters, teenagers during the pandemic. It kept them together. You've got many young people who are on the spectrum and many other things, and it really did help keep them together. But I think it also creates high anxiety from a very young age, when the whiteboard goes up, and from 3 years on, you're told you have information coming at you all the time, and boredom is not something that is part of our lives anymore. And I think that's a shame, because I think as a youngster, boredom is quite important. The brain is resting, and but I just feel contentment is something that's not really considered or talked about in our society anymore.
Very interesting. And do you think contentment is more difficult to achieve in the fast-paced world of technology and social media?
Yes, I feel that the opportunity for contentment is not something that's offered to younger generations. Those of us that are older would like to feel it more often. But I feel that life is full of the good, the bad, and everything in the middle. Yeah. And that's where boredom comes in as well. You can, it's time to think. You're on your own. You think about the things that you'd like to do. I remember, looking out of my front room window. I couldn't wait to be 18. I hated Sundays because there was so little to do. But now I wish Sundays were more like they used to be.
It's the first time I've heard that boredom is a good thing. But
boredom is definitely a good thing. It is the root of creativity.
I think that's when the eureka moments have come along in history.
Good. There's a lady there, and then a gentleman there.
Yes, just developing more on from what you were saying, is that the world isn't going to get any better in terms of I believe, in terms of wars and terrible things happening. So for me, the only way to create, for the world to get better, is to nurture peace within, as you were saying, in a self-transformation way, so that we should try and open up a window to each child to understand what it is to feel peaceful in spite of everything that's going on around them, because it's going to continue going on around them all their lives. There's awful things happening all the time, and somehow they've got to find a way within themselves with encouraging this nurturing aspect within themselves to feel peaceful. And there is a way to do that.
Yes, absolutely. And then it goes back to some of the ancient philosophy of the Stoics, you know, what you can control, what's beyond your control. Absolutely. There's a gentleman at the front, and then we go to Michael. You've got another comment as well online. So we go to Michael after, I think this gentleman here was next.
Hello, John Nissen. I think it's a good idea if we introduce ourselves first, well, at least by name. I'm very interested in climate change, but I do, on this, while we're on the social subject, I think we're moving very much towards the 1984 nightmare. We might all be content, but we're having our lives manipulated. And I think when Cambridge Analytica started using the data about human individuals' qualities and characteristics in order to, and then sold that to people who wanted to manipulate elections. That was a real bombshell, letting that kind of system of trawling people for their characteristics in order to influence them. And it's being taken over by a big business. It's not so much government. Some governments are like this, but our lives are increasingly controlled by big business, and the big pharma have a lot to be guilty of as far as the allowing the epidemic to spread, because they were very happy, and they extorted huge amounts from Boris Johnson. He called it bribery, but there are now billionaires among the pharmaceutical companies who made vaccines. As a result, you know, they've made huge benefit out of our misery. And this is the kind of scenario that I worry about greatly. Now, I would actually rather like to move on to a different subject, more the planet that we live in, because we've got a climate crisis. Now, as Steven Pinker said, we can make things better if we treat it as a problem to be solved, rather than an apocalypse to come. And the Gaia hypothesis from James Lovelock is similarly, we as a species on the planet should alter our environment to suit ourselves. And he says that other people have done that. So we need a solution to the climate crisis. We need to alter our environment to suit ourselves. There's a problem there to be solved, and it's not being solved. And it's not being solved because again, it's the fossil fuel companies think that that the solution is about reducing emissions, So they've so they're dealing with the IPCC and influencing them, downplaying climate change, whereas we all know that things are getting worse. We actually need to do something very different by way of cooling the planet, because the planet is too hot. So there is a solution there, but very few people are talking about a realistic solution. They're still following this mantra that we must reduce emissions. It's just not working. It's not going to work. It's not going to save the Arctic sea ice. It's not going to cool the planet on a reasonable timescale. And this is the thing that worries me most for young people today, that we're just missing the vital solution. But I have hope in a few young people who have grasped this nettle and are pushing for planetary cooling and refreezing the Arctic. I'm sorry I've spoken for far too long, but I hope I've stimulated.
Can I think your contribution is very useful, because I think it's pulled into an area we haven't discussed yet, and you did it very thoroughly. I think also in passing, can I remark, we talked about the effect of social media and the internet. What we haven't discussed is whether the people who run it are altogether honest players. And I think the evidence is they're probably not. And I think that's almost more the danger, because you're quite right about things like Cambridge Analytica. And you know, what is Facebook trying to do? I mean, you've got Clegg, you know, defending it. I wouldn't trust a word that Clegg said. You know, and that worries me. And I think you're right about the climate. It's interesting, you mentioned Lovelock and Gaia theory. He was rather ambivalent about that, because though he said that the Earth was a self-regulating organism, he actually was quite a sort of strong environmentalist and thought there were things we ought to do to save the world. So I think he never quite sort of squared the circle with his Gaia hypothesis. And you're also right, I think, in suggesting, and Pinker, I think, is right in suggesting you could solve the problem if you wanted to. What worries me is that people don't seem to want to solve the problem. That seems to me the real problem. Now, I think that's interesting, because I think you've opened up a whole lot of new threads in our discussion.
I mean, just in response to that, I mean, we've talked about technology and the interconnectedness of everything. So it's not as if the world and the various participants don't have some awareness of the issues that are facing us from a climate perspective, because the information is everywhere. And I just want to come back to you and say, given that we're already sitting on a burning platform, why do you believe not more is being done, given that all the participants from all the different factions know the issues involved?
Well, I think, is this on?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I'm not very good at this microphone holding. Yes. Why hasn't anything been done? It's a very interesting question. But there's a term called geoengineering, which is actually trying to alter the climate in favor of humans, and it's become a dirty word among a lot of scientists, at any rate. I dare say 90% of the population had never even heard of geoengineering, but it was frowned upon because it sounds like playing God for us to actually try and manipulate our environment on such a scale. And we're very happy to do it on a small scale, you know, build houses to have a home environment and that kind of thing, build dams. But to do it on a global scale is huge, and people feel it's against nature. Nature should be looking after us, and it's very fundamental when you're sitting on your mother's knee to be told that, you know, Mother Nature is looking after us. Well, unfortunately, the Earth system is the physical embodiment of Mother Nature, and the Earth system is accelerating away from the norms of our present period called the Holocene. And we have to nudge it back into the Holocene conditions, and that involves geoengineering. It involves large-scale cooling intervention. And there is a way to do that because volcanoes do it. Volcanoes can have a huge effect on the Earth's temperature. Pinatubo eruption in 1991, I think it was, cooled the planet by 0.5 degree. So we know that if we put sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, we can cool the planet. But there's so much antipathy to the idea of putting a chemical, God forbid, up into the stratosphere, even though volcanoes do it. If we do it, it seems to so many people that it's a terrible thing to do. But latest research is that it's actually quite possible. So without adverse effects. So it's become madness not to be doing it.
Okay, so that's an interesting view. So can we geoengineer our way out of this? David, do you want to?
There's also a gentleman behind as well, I think, who's waiting.
Geoengineering. Absolutely potty. We've got the means in our hands to solve the problems. We're being fed so many false ideas. Nuclear power is going to solve all our problems. I mean, originally they said it was going to be too cheap to. Now, I mean, there's been research done that shows that if you do your energy accounting properly, you end up with actually putting more energy into nuclear power than you get out. And that means by doing your energy accounting, starting with mining the uranium, refining uranium, building the power station, all that concrete and all the energy going into that, you've then got 30 years of energy coming out. And you've then got hundreds of years of looking after the waste. Well, you've got the decommissioning, which is energy then going in again. Then you've got all the hundreds of years of looking after the waste. And it's when there have been some scientists have done the sums, and they find that you've actually, over the hundreds of years necessary, you've actually put more energy in than you've got coming out. So there's one thing to think about. But of course, they like nuclear energy because it's the byproduct. You can make bombs out of the material, and so you know we need a nuclear industry because we need bombs, don't we? I mean, in the 70s, I remember going to a lecture somewhere here in Bath. A chap from the nuclear industry was trying to tell everyone how good nuclear power was, and I can remember him putting his hand in his pocket, and he pulled out a piece of glass about the size of a bar of soap. And he said, this will represent all the energy of one person's lifetime. And he said, that's what we're working towards. We're glassifying this waste. I asked him the question. I said, if that was the real thing, would you have it in your pocket? And he said, oh, no, it'd be behind 3 foot of lead. So, I mean, they still haven't done it. And, you know, there are some problems which may never be solved in this.
Well, let's have a show of hands, and that is, how many of us think that technology will resolve the climate issues we're facing to the end of this century?
Sorry, can I just rephrase that question? Because I think the question should be, how many people think technology could resolve the problem?
Okay, no, that's fair.
Can I finish? I went on about nuclear energy, and you know, but I mean, it's been more work has been done, and it's been shown that if we spent the money that's going into nuclear energy on insulating houses, we would actually save more energy than the nuclear industry can produce.
David, absolutely.
Can I say, I don't believe that you've done the numbers on that.
Yeah, but let's not break into an argument. I think let's have the show of hands with Mike's interjection. How many of us think that technology could solve our climate issues by the end of this century?
Yes.
Okay, so about half. Okay.
There was a wonderful guy called David Mackay who sadly died, but he was a government advisor. And one of the things he said was, before you discuss any of these things, you must do the numbers. And his conclusion certainly was that there's no way we can get to zero carbon without nuclear energy.
Yeah.
But he described how people come up with ideas, which are good ideas, but if you don't do the numbers, somebody, for example, said, why don't we use the verges alongside motorways to grow biofuel? And the calculation comes out that if you wanted to grow enough fuel for one lane of traffic, you'd have to have 8 kilometers of verge each side to grow enough. So it's very important to actually look at the numbers and calculate rather than just to wave one's hands on these subjects.
The problem with that is it's always lies, dumb lies, and statistics, and everybody has their own numbers. But there's a gentleman over there. Do you want to ask your question?
Of course, I want to ask a question.
Okay, then this gentleman next.
So I'm microphone Mark. I've been running around the microphone.
I know.
And I'm taking advantage of this moment.
We might need to change you.
Change you?
Change you from being the microphone man.
Yes, now I'm the speaker man.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to say was going back to what you were saying earlier about contentment. I'm thinking that the world is getting better in a way because a lot of authors since the pandemic, especially, I've seen lots of books talking about contentment and ease of being, and those being like targets. And one book I read called Utopia for Realists, it kind of blew my mind, which ties into the climate change and why we have these problems that we're not solving. He's defined GDP, or measure of economic growth, as a measure of suffering. So the example he gives is two guys around the same age. One is in a happy family. They cook their own meals. They walk. They cycle. They spend time in nature. They don't buy many clothes. They have community. They don't spend a lot of money. They're not making much for GDP. The other guy, same age, same family, but he's going through a messy divorce. He's buying cars. He's gambling. He's drinking lots of alcohol. He's making the economy go up. So one factor of like why we're being driven by social media and these other things to be more anxious, to be more upset, and the marketing is because that makes the economy grow. We buy stuff instead of finding ease and contentment within, because that doesn't help the economy. And the other factor that's been really accelerating since the 70s is the focus on short-term profit for shareholders. So we got all these long-term problems. We're not going to fix it today because we need short-term profit today. There's long-term profit in fixing the climate, but today would cost us money. And our shareholders, they're going to die soon. They need the money right now. So that's what I want to say about. And I think the world's getting a better place in a way because a lot of people are writing books and figuring this out themselves. And I'm going back to the lockdown again because I think that gave people time to think, why am I spending money on sandwiches? Why am I contributing to this economy that isn't really helping anybody? Instead, I miss community, I miss friends, and it became more valuable.
Thank you. Before we go to the back of the room, I think, Michael, you've got your hand up again, so please make your contribution.
Yes, I'm 85 years old now, and I feel that I've lived in a relatively fortunate period in historical terms, but I'm in my old age now. It's the situation seems to be of a very dramatic change. We have we've talked about the climate challenge. We've talked about, we've touched on the technology, about the mass communications. We haven't talked about the geopolitics and weapons of mass destruction, which are becoming more generally available from not just on a large scale, but on a smaller scale too. And also, of course, the pace of change in technology is accelerating, and particularly this artificial intelligence. And there seem to be huge challenges now for the future. But these are two-edged things, and I think a lot of what's been the talk tonight has been somewhat pessimistic. I personally, if I was looking at the world, if you went back, if I could come forward 60 years and be looking at the prospect now, I think I would be I would be optimistic, I think, rather than pessimistic, because I think the things that we've been talking about do offer tremendous potential, and there are huge dangers. And indeed, this means that the world now is a very challenging place, and it's a totally and utterly different one to the one that I was, the prospect for me when I was setting out 60 years ago. Another point that hasn't been mentioned, of course, is that now, and increasingly so, we're living in cities, whereas in history, including recent history, the majority of people have lived in rural communities where things are much more stable. We're living in cities now, and it seems to me that living in cities, again, is a two-edged thing. It offers huge potential for collaboration and coexistence and personal development. And so I would like to say that I would be an optimist, I think. Well, I am an optimist. I won't be around to see it, but I am an optimist about the possibilities over the next few decades. But it is a very challenging environment.
Thank you very much.
One point, by the way, that I did note just now was that on this format that we have of online as well as people in the room, there was a lady with us at the beginning of the talk who was tuned in from Melbourne in Australia.
Yes.
And she said she had to leave now because she was going to work. But I mean, that is really quite an interesting point, isn't it? The potential for this sort of technology, which we're experiencing now.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Michael.
Hello. Yeah, I was just going to make the point about the lady from Melbourne. I thought that was fantastic that somebody from the other side of the world could take part in a debate. I was just thinking of the one positive thing that technology is looking at the moment is the ITER project in the south of France, where we're developing nuclear fusion, and that's something that something like 3/4 countries representing 3/4 of the world's population are involved in, and that's a game changer, and that's going to be that should lead to unlimited power with very little unpleasant waste products. I mean, that's a complete game changer. That's something for optimism. And the other thing is, I would like to say, is man-made global warming as a concept, I think only came out in the late 1890s. When I was young, people didn't believe it, but now people are believing it, and we are doing something about it. Maybe we should do more and we should do it quicker. But I think that's another grounds for optimism as well. We're doing something about it. And I think Greta Thunberg's doing a fantastic job, although I wouldn't personally invite her around for tea. But I think those are causes for optimism.
Okay.
May I just correct a couple of statements that were made there? I'm suspicious, I'm afraid, about things like fusion, because the problem is you're making all this energy in one place and you're having to transfer it all over the place, which does lead to problems. And that's why there is a lot more to be said for things like wind power and solar power, which are at the point of use. And actually, Don says quite rightly, you need to do the arithmetic. And if you do the arithmetic, solar power and wind power more or less would do it.
Well,
certainly in this country.
I certainly.
Secondly,
sorry, go on.
you're wrong about when people were aware of global warming. I was involved in the ecology movement back in the very early 1970s.
Yeah.
And there were people who were then very aware. And interestingly enough, I'll tell you who was aware. It was the geographers. This is a sort of university thing. They were aware. It was the technologists who were aware. Few of the biological scientists were a bit aware, but the people on the art side didn't understand what it was about and didn't think it mattered. And the people on the legal side, sort of people who go on to be politicians, never knew what it was about and never understood it.
Sorry, could just one very quickly. I wasn't saying we shouldn't be using nuclear. I shouldn't be using wind power and solar. Of course we should, but
I don't disagree with you. I do disagree with this gentleman about nuclear power. I think, as Lovelock thought, it was actually a very good interim and a necessary interim phase.
Just wanted to say about fusion. I mean, there's so much fusion up there. We've only got to harvest a tiny percentage of it. We've got more than far more than we need. Instead of spending money on trying to do it here, it's all there. It's already being done.
Oh yeah, we got rid of the hole in the ozone layer by banning CFCs, didn't we? So that's something good that's happened.
Sorry?
We got rid of the hole in the ozone layer by banning CFCs.
Yes, quite. Yes,
and that's a good thing. Yeah, so there is technology that's happening that's working.
Yeah.
I was going to speak again, but if someone who hasn't spoken wants to go instead, I can give over the mic. I was just wondering, I was thinking that this question, like for me, it's personal, and I think it's deeply political. Like, is the world getting a better place? And I was thinking about some of the names you had here, like Marx and Matt Ridley, two very different people. But I guess the question that was occurring to me is kind of, what does it do? What does it do for you to say that the world is getting better or the world is not getting better? Like Marx, as you say there, had, as part of his philosophy, there was an inevitability towards it. People who believed in Marxism, I mean, in some ways that was seen as a contradiction, because they're saying, well, why are you fighting for it if it's going to happen anyway? But it gave people conviction, and it was seen as scientific and like, well, we just need to push a little bit harder because it's going to happen. And then Matt Ridley, when I sort of I've got the Rational Optimist book. When I read that, I just see, I mean, he is a Tory peer. I just see a sort of defense of the status quo and just a massive defense of kind of, privilege and just basically like, And so for him, I think it kind of covers up, it's basically a sticking plaster saying, don't change the world. So I guess if anyone has any deeper or more interesting thoughts about what a belief that the world is going to hell or the world is getting better actually does, like now for you, or how you want to change the world.
I think it's interesting to bring up Matt Ridley, or the fifth Viscount Ridley, who has a net wealth of about £5 million, owns a coal mine, has areas that are potentially fracking, and didn't seem to learn anything from crashing Northern Rock under his leadership. So I think he's a man, I mean, I read the book with great interest, but I think he's a man who's an extreme libertarian, just believes that, we can have the Wild West and it'll all turn out right. And I think you're quite right. And a lot of other people have nailed him for what he is.
I think for me, what I find what strikes me about the very question is just how complex it is. And the moment you start to drill into anything, such as, for example, the issue of climate change, people, it seems to me, often end up, in order to try and feel they've got at least some kind of coherent view that they can then, take as their foundation and use in how they engage with others, I think the risk is that we notice the evidence that confirms what we think, and that disproves the opposite of what we think. And I suppose, and I think this is the same, you know, when you look, for example, one talks about technological solutions. Very often the difficulty is that the focus on technological solutions is divorced from the realities of human nature or political systems or all the other things within which the technology needs to be, within which it needs to be applied. And so it then leaves me, from a kind of philosophical perspective, wondering, where does that leave me? You know, and I think probably where it leaves me is feeling that I almost have to, almost as a point of principle, look to question not only what I'm thinking, but what others are thinking, and try to avoid oversimplifying things, to avoid the groupthink that can come when, you know, we feel comfortable, when we feel we're surrounded by people who share a similar view of the world. And I know from personal experience, that's often a very uncomfortable place to be, because you end up with everyone kind of, you know, not being able to kind of understand why on earth you should imagine, you know, you should see the world or be asking questions about the world that are at variance with how they see it. But in a way, I think to round off, it feels to me one of the things that maybe we would all benefit from in terms of trying to both deepen our understanding of the world, of how it is and how it can be improved, is by spending a bit more time trying to understand, and not only the scientific evidence, but also the perspectives that different groups of people have, etc., and try and avoid rushing to some kind of premature conclusion about, well, this is the solution or that is the solution, because the kind of things that we may need to do in order to try and enhance the development of the world, natural and human, are highly complex, and of course that's a very uncomfortable reality to live with, because it makes us feel a bit powerless. And I think probably, you know, having an understanding of the bigger picture may leave us feeling powerless, but then within our own lives, often there are very beneficial things that we can do in terms of how we live, how we treat people around us, etc., etc. So it's that link for me between the complexity of the bigger picture, but also the real difference you can make day to day in terms of how you choose to live.
Yeah, the Gaia hypothesis. I think that what Duncan has said there is a understanding of only part of it, because Gaia, whatever we do to the Earth, Gaia will put it right, but the solution may well be getting rid of us.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. So I think the really interesting observations, because one is, I suppose, we are part of the world. You know, we're not separate from the world, and I think the sooner we realize that, we may take some different approaches to ourselves, to each other, and also to the world in general. And I think it was really telling, and this is your comment, what was really telling during the World in 2050 series, which we run here, is that a lot of people who came to the talks felt disempowered. They felt that the world was being done onto them. Right? So actually, you know, what they believed, they can believe one party or the other, but it really didn't help them to be any more informed or convinced about what to do. And I think it's only when we drilled it down to what we can do as individuals to make the world a better place, that people actually found a grounding for what can be done to not just do something to make the place a better world, but actually to feel better about that rather than being disempowered. So I think that's really, really good observations.
Oh.
Get rid of marketing. Get rid of the idea that snack your way to a better day that if I'm going to buy a new dress, a new house, a new anything, that's going to make my life better. Instead of looking with this next thing, there's my happiness, my contentment. Let's look around in the room. Oh, look, we've got a great group of gentlemen who've set up this meeting. We've got our friends online, our friends down under. And look at that. Count this amongst the blessings that, yes, we can still talk to people and meet up and sort of look to what we already have and try and appreciate it more rather than the next thing. And there is one other word that I hear, steady state economy, rather than simply growth and companies getting monumental. Let's just say for good enough. And yes, you can stay in business, have a little extra profit, but you don't have, they don't need to be as big as they've been.
Ease of being, like I said earlier, but ease of being, aim for like ease of being, contentment, acceptance as counter to all the negativity to make the world a better place. Oh, yes, that's what I wanted to say. We went to a talk, my girlfriend and I, a few months ago where a company put nature on the board of directors. So they have a physical human representation of nature because they want the company to go in a way that makes the world a better place. So at the talk, I asked them two questions. I asked one, how do you define nature? And two, what are the goals of nature? Like, does nature want to work with humanity to expand? Does it want to go to other planets? Does it want to colonize Mars? Or does nature want mankind to stop messing with the planet and it wants our extermination? So, so it was interesting. You know.
What was the answer?
The two people who work for the company, they're like, we're not going to answer that. The lawyer who was representing nature, she's like, that's a great question. And they're like, we're not really sure what we mean by nature. They're trying to be, I guess, more in sync with the earth to generate less wasteful materials. But at the same side, we're in an economic system where it's all based on short-term profit. So there's only so far they can go towards long-term solutions.
No, well, I think that's at least somebody is starting to think slightly differently. I think the problem we face, I used to be an international business consultant, and I try to advise companies on broadening their measures of success, because measures of success generally still are very binary in you know, even as an individual. Never mind big companies, and we've heard about big pharma. Even at an individual level, you know, we measure our success in the Western world, at least, through material gain, possessions, and everything else. And then you bring this out from the individual to the collective and the company. It's about shareholder value. It's about profitability, etc. And we don't really have a sufficiently broad view of what success looks like. And I think the gentleman earlier talked about human flourishing. And if you take the word human out and just call it flourishing, you know, as a whole, what that would look like is very barely defined by anybody, even by the deepest ecologists. Is, you know, how do you bring flourishing to the world in its broader sense without getting too complex about it? And I think this is definitely something that the world and the individual will need to grapple with.
Maybe you can just measure stress. The less stressed people are, the better we are flourishing. And just another measurement of human sort of how well mankind is doing, I guess, is the lifespan, the life expectancy. And I think in the UK, in the last couple of years, it's gone down for the first time. It's always been going up, but now it's going down.
Lifespan, health span. So it's lifespan, health span, and looking at people like Michael, still he looks fairly well for his 80s, where I've seen people in their 60s that don't look as functional now. So to live a long life, what's the point if one's going to be unwell? We also want the health to go along with it.
I think one of the interesting things people have talked about, sort of stress and angst. It seems to me that what we're having is a sort of democratization of angst. Someone talked about the time when sort of Jane Austen's generation lived here, By the time she lived here, the place was past its best anyway, and she hated the place. But that's beside the point. If you look at that sort of upper class at the time, they were full of angst, worried about what people thought of them, and and were they top dogs and whatever. And the ordinary people didn't. They just got on with their daily lives. And what's happened with rising, living standards and things like the internet is there's been this sort of democratization of angst. Everybody can have angst now. It used to be an upper class reserve. And I think that's sort of the way, that democratization leads. You get the good and you get the bad with it.
So we've talked a lot about like sort of happiness and contentment and flourishing as like the sort of goals that define whether the human aspect of the world is becoming better. But like, is there also the pursuit of knowledge and like truth? I'm sure as philosophers, we've all heard of the sort of the thought experiment of the eternal happiness machine, where you could be plugged into a fake reality where you would experience perfect happiness. You wouldn't know you're in this reality once you've been plugged in, but you have to make the decision beforehand to accept the lie and be perfectly happy. Would you accept that choice? Would you accept the lie and be perfectly happy and deny the truth?
I think we all know the answer, that very few people would take that choice.
Yes,
For
exactly.
a start, they wouldn't trust the people running the machine, and quite rightly so.
But actually, it's an interesting thought experiment, because many people would argue we already live in that machine, right? We're already plugged in, through social media. We're already plugged in through our living standards, our material possessions. And I think it comes back to the point, I think the gentleman here has talked about being comfortably numb. This is my rock band Pink Floyd equivalent to what I think you said about contentment. That actually we're already living in 1984. But there's a big difference between the contentment that the lady talked about over there, which is actually being satisfied with enough, as opposed to being comfortably numb because we're just being fed something artificial. But a lot of people would argue, as a thought experiment, nobody would press the button. The other side of things, we're already living partly in that world, and some of us have already pressed the button because we're already running after certain material gains and possessions, and we're already in the machine. So I think it's interesting how you perceive it, and it just shows that our own psychology has a lot to do with how we see the world and how we see it becoming a better or worse place.
Yeah, I think that's true. Although you can change. I was someone who's very optimistic. I must say now, to be quite honest, and my cards on the table, I have become exceptionally pessimistic because of the climate crisis. Because I don't think there's a political will to solve that problem. Technology could, but we've got an idiot. I won't mention, won't get political, who thinks that it's, going to be to his gain to roll back, the attempt to control the climate crisis. And when we've got idiots like that, then I think we're in deep trouble.
Because we live in a democracy, and the politicians are only as powerful as what the people will accept.
Yeah, well, I think those politicians might soon go and might get some more enlightened ones.
Well, it's a matter of opinion, but I think you may find they follow them in because they're under the same pressures.
Okay, well, it's coming up to 9 o'clock, so I think we probably need to draw things to a conclusion unless there's somebody who wants to have a final say. Everybody's looking at that lady over there, so.
Well, it was a very simple point, and it's not, I'm not a philosopher, but I'm very interested in philosophy. The words of the Dalai Lama, who has, there's a lot of suffering that he has had in his life, but he believes that, if we live with compassion and in service, we will be happy. Yeah. And that's coming from within. Yeah. So sorry if it's not relevant.
No, that's particularly relevant because I think the Dalai Lama is a philosopher. I think the only thing that's important is to define compassion, because if compassion is something that we just have an emotional feeling about something, the Dalai Lama calls that emotional soppiness. And he defines compassion as karuna, which is basically, you can only be compassionate if you take action to alleviate somebody else's suffering. If all you do is are emotively involved and feel sorry, that is not sufficient to be a truly compassionate human being. Yes, correct.
So shall we?
Colin,
Colin is coming. He's the man with the microphone. He's the last say. And you already had you.
I've had more than enough time to say.
We've talked a little bit about Matt Ridley's book, The Rational Optimist, which I thought was quite a good title, but is extremely passive. And maybe that's his objective, is that we should all be passive and allow him to determine what happens. There's another book I read which covers similar ground, some which I don't agree with, which is called How to Be a Good Ancestor. And I think that is a much more active title, and the book is much more about how you can make a contribution rather than passively expect the world to sort itself out.
Yeah, I think I'd also put a word in for Pinker's book, The Better Angels. I think that is a seriously scientific book and does show how humanity's changed over vast periods of time, and it's well based and the evidence is there.
And I don't think we've solved all the problems this evening.
Oh, wow.
But I didn't expect to for a moment. But before we wind up, I'll just remind you, if you're not on the newsletter and you'd like to be, come up and put your email thing on. So the only other thing I'd say is usually at this point of the evening, I would thank the speaker, but thank you all, because you've all been the speaker.
Don, can I put in just one epilogue, you see? This question, as a gentleman over there pointed out, has no answer. That's what makes it a truly philosophical question. Because philosophical questions don't have answers. Well, they have answers, but not definitive answers.
Well, some of them do.
So I hope you enjoyed it. The first Café Philo in at least 3, 4, or even 5 years. Can we just have a show of hands? Who would like to have Café Philos in the future rather than the normal talks program from time to time? Yeah. Okay, so quite a few. Good. Well,
you've got votes there as well online.
And we've got the votes online as well. Excellent. Well, we've got 100% success rate online, which is good. Good. Well, look, in the meantime, I think we hopefully see you all for Professor A.C. Grayling, and his talk in December is going to be Philosophy and Life. So I think what he's going to be talking about is not academic philosophy, but actually philosophy as part of life. So I shall see you then, and in the meantime, have a very safe journey home.